feel like I'm going to get halfway through the message and my voice is going to give out. So this might be a short message. Maybe some of you want to pray for that. I don't know. But get to lunch early. No, I'll try to. I'll try. I gotta get amen. That's right. That's right. Oh, that's funny. That's great. We're going to start in James chapter 3. It's only taken us 2 or 3 months. We've gotten to James chapter 3. We are moving along pretty quick here, and I think this is going to be a good study about our speech. James has already alluded to this a little bit last evening, and Martha was really helpful for this. We were rifling through our CDs trying to find a song. Someone we know, in fact, he visited the church here a couple times several years ago. Craig Gleason, he's a local uh, country music artist. He does all kinds of things, actually. But we were trying to find. I knew that there was a song that he had about words and about the words we used, and we found it. And the premise, I had forgot. I remembered the chorus. The premise is kind of funny. It's two guys. It's two. A guy. He says, me and my buddy were hanging out. We started talking about college football, and an innocuous discussion arose about who's better, Georgia or Tennessee. And then mom comes in from the other room to break up the fist fight. So it started with the words, and then it escalated beyond that. Mom comes in and she says this about words. The name of the song is called "You Can't Take 'Em Back." It says, "Words are like a live grenade after the pins have been pulled. There ain't no getting it back in the gate after you've released the bull. Like water flushed, a kiss and a hug, a rock from a slingshot, a bullet from the gun. Those words are just like that. You just can't take them back." And I thought that was good. And then the second verse is they say, well, let's talk about something else. And it breaks out into a fist fight. Mom comes back and she repeats the thing, the whole thing. Words like, but it really is true. I especially love that a rock from a slingshot, a bullet from a gun. Words are like that. You just can't take them back. And I think that's why James is going to spend so much time on this issue of our words. And as I was preparing this, I thought, man, I feel like we just did a message on, words and Christians, how Christians ought to speak. And was it in First Corinthians? Was it in I don't know, Deuteronomy? We were in Deuteronomy for a while. Was it in Proverbs? Was it in Psalms? Was it from the Gospels? And I got to think, wait a minute, the whole Bible everywhere talks about our Christian communication. This isn't the definitive and only place where the Bible refers to how Christians should speak. In fact, I bet if we were to start thinking about certain passages in the Gospels, or even just the fact that one of the books that we just read from, Psalms, it's all about our speech, how we communicate our faith, both to God, to others, how we worship, how we praise, how we express our lament or our frustrations with life. It's amazing how much of the Bible talks about our words and the words that we use. We know that speech is an important part of how we express our Christian faith. And I think we think, well, there's a lot of metrics. There's a lot of ways we measure our spiritual growth or our maturity. There's service. There's our giving. There's how we respond to situations that that shows how we've matured in our faith. There's our doctrinal knowledge and acuity. How well can we articulate some of the doctrines of Christianity? That's a sign of spiritual maturity, right? Speech, however, seems to be we think of speech as just one more area where we can measure how well we have matured in our spiritual lives. I think James has been throwing a lot of kind of counterintuitive stuff at us. Not just counterintuitive for people, but people in the world, counterintuitive for us as believers. I think James is going to raise the bar on speech and assert that the taming of the tongue is the key to spiritual maturity. That if we can get that one right, we can learn lessons that can transfer to other ways in which we demonstrate spiritual maturity. If we can get that right, we can get a lot of other things right, because it is so difficult to tame the tongue. You see in your handout there, the ability to tame the tongue demonstrates a high level of spiritual maturity. Control over the tongue is important because it steers the whole body. And if we get to it, the danger of not taming the tongue is the presence of verbal inconsistency and hypocrisy in our lives. And I think as we talk about hypocrisy a lot. I think this is one more place where we get in trouble. So let's just kind of break this down and go go point by point here. Let's look at verses 1 and 2. We're in James chapter 3, verses 1 and 2. He says, "Let not many of you become teachers, my brethren, knowing that as such we will incur a stricter judgment. For we all stumble in many ways. If anyone does not stumble in what he says, he is a perfect man, able to bridle the whole body as well." James is giving us a few head fakes here. We're going to talk about teaching, right? Nope. I'm just kind of throwing that out there. We're going to talk about, self-control, right? Well, no, we're going to talk about the tongue and the use of the tongue in Christian speech. So he gives us a few head fakes here, but those head fakes are still important. So let's discuss a few of those. First of all, he addresses, there seems to be a movement in this church or some of these churches that he's writing to, that some of the believers want to rush into a teaching post or a teaching position in a church, or as the main preacher or something like that, and he is going to warn them about that. He's warning them to be a little less eager to pursue teaching positions in the church. This is a little awkward because I think just 2 days ago I sent an email out to our teachers about electives in the fall. Please be a teacher. I want you to be like, man, he's sent a lot of inconsistent signals to it. What does he want to do? Does he want me to teach? Does he not want me to teach? I don't know what to do. No, we want you to teach. I think the idea here, though, is James is trying to say this is not something we should rush into. This is not someone becomes a believer and they're in church for 3 months and then we're going to thrust them into a teaching position. I'm sure I've talked about this a couple of times as I've studied the charismatic movement. And other movements are like this as well. Other dangerous movements are like this as well. But as study the charismatic movement, you find that you have individuals in those movements who got maybe a year of Bible of Bible training, and that's dangerous because you need those other 4 years, those other 2 or 3 years to kind of humble you. At the end of the first year, you think you know everything, and then they get that first year, and then they go off into their teaching ministry, and they end up veering into a lot of error that probably another year or two of learning and growing and having their ideas formulated would have been better. They rushed into teaching a little too fast. But we've got to be careful of that. His warning, I think, is they have to be mature to teach the doctrines and practices. And apparently they can't even control their tongues. So why do we think that they're going to be good as teachers? That's part of the warning. Now, in context, this verse is not contradicting Hebrews chapter 5, verse 12. If you want to flip back a couple of pages to Hebrews chapter 5, verse 12. The author of Hebrews, we went through Hebrews a couple of years ago. The author of Hebrews is a little frustrated with the flock to whom he is writing. They're dealing with some difficulties, some legitimate persecution, and they're starting to kind of drift back to their Jewish roots, so drifting away from Christianity. They're believers, presumably. Most of them are actual believers, and the author of Hebrews has taught them. But he says in chapter 5, verse 12, he says, "For though by this time you ought to be teachers, you have need again for someone to teach you the elementary principles of the oracles of God, and you have come to need milk and not solid food." He said, "Listen, guys, you're mature. You should be mature enough at this point that you should be teaching too." So teaching is a metric for maturity. It is a way to gauge if you've come along and you've learned and grown, and God has done some things in your life, and you've sat under good teaching and you've learned good doctrine and you've learned how to execute that. Then yes, you should be teaching as well. The author here says all of you should be involved in teaching. And I would even take it a step further. I think every believer, whether you're gifted in teaching or not, every believer, whatever your talents or gifts are, should strive to have some kind of effective teaching relationship, a discipleship relationship, where you're meeting with someone on a regular basis, or you're getting together with someone, or you're kind of keeping tabs on someone, and you can teach them into their lives, an interpersonal edification and discipleship relationship, even if it's not a formal teaching position in the church or teaching an elective or something like that. Now, one concern here, back to James chapter 3, verse 1, another concern is that they will arouse greater or provoke greater judgment upon themselves. And indeed, those who stand before others to lead and to teach must be sure of the precision of their teaching and of the consistency of their walk. So there is a level of maturity that is necessitated there. And he says you've got to be careful that you're not going to receive stricter judgment for that. We think then that James is going to describe teaching. Okay, so here's what a teacher should look like. Here's what the ministry should be like. But he's going to go a little more specific than that, not just talking about teaching, but about speaking and the believer's speech in general. Uh, and that's what he's going to focus on. We should not presume ourselves to be ready to teach, in that we stumble in many ways. He says that in verse 2. And we usually stumble in our use of the tongue. So that's kind of the flow here in verses 1 and 2. Don't presume to be a teacher, because we all stumble. We especially stumble in the tongue. And then he's like, hey, let's talk about how we stumble in the tongue and how important it is to make sure we are controlling the tongue. The word, by the way, the word that is used here for to stumble, patio is the word, to stumble, to cause someone to stumble in some cases. It was used previously in James chapter 2, verse 10. It is always used in a metaphorical sense it's never used of someone is walking down the road and they actually trip. It's always used in a metaphorical sense of someone moral stumbling of some kind. It's one thing to not stumble in our actions, but I think what he's trying to say here, in fact, it says that at the end, he's a perfect man, able to bridle the whole body as well, if they cannot stumble in what he says. I think he's trying to, I think if we push on the text just a little bit, I think what we find is he's trying to say there's maturity in our actions, there's maturity in some of the external things we do, but there's really a high level of maturity needed to control the tongue. And I was thinking about, you're sitting in a meeting or you're just standing there talking with people, and someone says something just really awful, and you just kind of want to hit them or something like that, okay? And but you say, yeah, but then we're gonna get into a fight, and I'm not gonna, then mom's gonna come in and recite a country song to us or something. I don't want to even deal with it now. Maybe just more for practicality's sake, I'm not going to do it. A lot of our actions are either ones or zeros. They're on or off. I'm going to do it or I'm not going to do it. And you often decide, for expediency's sake, usually, to not do it. When it comes to speaking, it's not just on and off. And we've talked about this. It's a lot more complicated. There's a lot more things going on. And I think what James is saying is, if you could bridle that and think about all the ways in which you need to control your speech to make it effective, then controlling other things in your life won't be that difficult. Now, we talked about this, and I'm kind of channeling Proverbs here a little bit. We've talked about how Proverbs talks about speech includes your content, it includes your tone, it includes your timing. And even there you have, too harsh, not harsh enough. You have too soon, too late, not at all. You have all kinds of different things you're trying to balance. It's not just on off, like I'm going to do it or I'm not going to do it. It's all kinds of axes in which you have to figure out what's the balancing point, what's the middle point that would make what I'm about to say most effective. And James says, if you can kind of on the fly really be discerning about what you're about to say, how you're going to say it, whether it's the right thing to say, whether it's the right timing, whether you should say it at all, if you can learn to do that, man, you've made a lot of spiritual progress. And you know what? There are people who are very judicious, very careful in what they say. And it's great. It's refreshing, honestly, to have someone like that. But he's saying, you've got to put a lot into that. So it's one thing to not stumble in our actions. It's another thing to be able to say or not say something that needs to be said or doesn't need to be said, and to balance those ideas of content and timing and tone. Mark Twain said the difference between the right word and the almost right word is the difference between lightning and the lightning bug. Okay, there's a big difference there. Just if you're just off a little bit, there could be a big difference in the result there. Stumble, when he says stumble here, by the way, he's not talking about some huge moral collapse or something like that. But it's not an inconsequential thing either. He says, listen, you can say something and realize you've stumbled, you caused someone else to stumble. It might be multiple instances of stumbling, a bad habit, a vice, or an insult we keep throwing out there. It could be a whole variety of things. But I think he's trying to make the statement that if we can control the tongue, we can really. That's a great metric, maybe the most important metric for spirituality. And he says this is a provocative statement. If you could control the tongue, You are a perfect, and again, I'm going to read that word perfect to mean mature. I don't think perfect meaning flawless. Now, unfortunately, when we hear the word perfect, we tend to think of sinless, flawless. He's obviously not saying that, but a mature, a very mature individual, a godly, mature individual who's taken the doctrines and the truths of Christianity and integrated them into their life to such an extent that they can speak grace and truth and mercy and knows what to say in different situations. The Spirit is working through them to affect that as well. But if he could control the speech and all of those different dynamics of what goes into speech, then you can control other things as well. The ability to tame the tongue demonstrates a high level of spiritual maturity. This statement that he makes at the end of verse 2 is so powerful, he's going to spend the next several verses using illustrations to demonstrate how possible or how important that is. Trying to prove that. Uh, just a couple more quotes here that I thought were interesting. That the song we read earlier talked about pistols and bullets in a gun. Existentialist philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre, who I really usually wouldn't quote from the pulpit, but I thought he said this: words are loaded pistols. It's interesting, and if they go off, that could be very dangerous. Henry Ward Beecher was an American preacher and abolitionist in the middle of the 1800s. He says, all words are pegs to hang ideas on. All words are pegs on which we hold ideas. And the words that come out of our mouths make other people form ideas about us. They're not just great philosophical ideas about freedom and liberty and government and all these kinds of things. But the words that come out of our mouths are pegs on the wall in which people hang ideas about us. Wow, they just say whatever comes into their mouth. They do whatever comes in their head. They just say it. Careless, thoughtless, not very mature, socially or spiritually. So it's not just the big ideas or the great philosophical treatises that contain these words that we hang ideas on. Words are pegs that people hang ideas about us on. And they're going to look at us, they're going to know that we're Christians, and now those ideas about us have been projected onto Jesus Christ in their minds. And you can say, that's not fair. You're probably right, but that's exactly what happens. And that's where I think God's people have not always been the best representatives, ambassadors for the Lord Jesus Christ. And I think that's very interesting. So a few implications before we move on. While James will continue to discuss the need to control the tongue, the principle is that if we learn godly and Christ-like self-control over our speech, then that will be easier to control the rest of what we do. I think a lot of times, I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit, but a lot of that times that means just kind of slowing down and stopping and saying, does what I want to say need to be said? And I've told you this before. I come up with all kind of jokes in my mind that maybe only I think are funny. I mean, in fact, I know that's true because I say them and nobody else thinks they're funny. And I think it's hilarious. Now, did you hear my family right there? They're laughing because they know, they understand. They just, wow, that was a dud. Crickets. I thought it was hilarious. I thought it was absolutely hilarious. Dad jokes, the highest form of humor. But then after, like, I could have just told that joke to myself, and the audience in my mind would have laughed, and the thing, and I said, hey, thanks for coming tonight. You've been a great audience, and I would have, gone to bed. And it was just all in my mind. It didn't have to be said. Because now I've formed an image. Oh, that was an inappropriate joke, or it shouldn't have been said at that time. And now I've created something about my character that is projected onto Jesus Christ. Sometimes we just need to think about what we say, and maybe just determine it doesn't need to be said. It can have a deleterious effect on how people think of us, and more importantly, how people think about Christ. It is far more difficult to control our words, our jokes, our offhanded comments, but learning to tame the tongue will provide lessons about self-control that are transferable to other areas of our lives. And that's why I think he says, listen, if he doesn't stumble in what he says, that's important, that's big, that's huge. because then it can bridle the whole body as well. I think that James is asserting that taming the tongue is not just a part, it's not just one of many metrics to our spiritual growth, how we gauge our spiritual growth. I think he's saying it's one of the keys to spiritual growth. Isn't it always amazing? You read the Gospels, Jesus always says the right thing. There's no like offhanded comment that he makes about, those Pharisees, it's always the right thing to say. And you're like, wow, how did he come up with that? Well, he's the God man, so that makes it easy. But it's always right tone, right content, right teaching. It's not always well received, but that's not his fault. That's someone else's fault. And that's true with us too. We might be convinced it's the right tone, right timing, right thing to say, but the reception might not always be there, but that might not always be our fault. So we got to be mindful of that as well. But I think James is asserting taming the tongue is the key or a key to spiritual maturity. Now he wants to prove this. He says, okay, you think that if I could tame the tongue, I could tame the whole body. You think that's crazy. Let me give you some illustrations of where that dynamic or that sense of disproportionality works in real life. And that's what he's going to do in verses 3 through 7. Control over the tongue is important because it steers the whole body. I think we're just going to go verse by verse here because each verse is a different illustration or a principle. So let's just start with this first one in verse 3. He says, now if we put bits into the horse. Let me start over. I'm Matt. I'm your pastor. Verse 3. Now if we put the bits into the horses' mouths so that they will obey us, we direct their entire body as well. And you think, wow, that makes a lot of sense. And I don't know that much of horses. Johanna is our resident equestrian expert. So she'll, if you need some other feedback, but this makes sense to me. I'm not an equestrian. I don't know much about this kind of stuff. But it makes sense. From what I know about horses, it makes sense. And what I think is funny is they came across this conclusion probably after a lot of trial and error. Ancient people were like, how about we put a strap of leather around the neck and that'll work? And the guy gets kicked off. And how about we stand right behind him and we just kind of that did not work either. That did not work. A lot of trial and error. I think about that. A lot of our inventions, trial and error. How much trial and error went into X before they decided to do Y? Like a catcher's mask. How many times did these poor catchers have to get it in the chops before we should give that poor guy a mask. That poor guy, his nose is off to the side of his. Let's give this guy a mask. That's the least we could do for him. Nice guy. Shin guards in soccer. How many kids had to get it before they had to get shin guards? Finally they say, you know what? I got it. We'll put a bit in the horse's mouth. We're going to pull one side to the other, pull back, pull forward. And now we can control the whole animal. Hundreds of thousands of years of trial and error. Now we got this. And by the way, that's technology that we still use today. So they figured it out back then. We're still using it today. Okay. Fantastic. He says we can control the entire animal with this. And it's a perfect illustration of how controlling the mouth is going to control the whole body of the horse. And you say, well, that was about speech. I understand that. But if you and I can control our mouths, can bridle our mouths too, it's going to control the whole animal, the whole being, the whole body, the whole course of our lives. It's a perfect illustration for James. The word that he uses here for bit is a word that's only used a few times, kalanos. But the word he had used up in verse 2, the verb to bridle, bridle, was kalanos agagoe. And agagoe means or agago actually, means to lead. So the verb means to lead by means of a bridle. And now he's just using the word bridle here in verse 3. The purpose is to use something in the mouth to create enough compliance in the horse and obedience to be able to direct the horse where you want him to go. The strength of the horse needs to be guided toward productive use. Otherwise, that productivity and that effort will be lost. The efforts, in fact, not only will the power and the productivity of the horse be lost, what if the opposite happens and the horse becomes destructive because you are not able to control the horse. That could happen as well. Similarly, our tongues and our bodies need to be guided by our redeemed, maturing mentality to prevent us from wandering toward uselessness or even destruction. We need to bridle and control our mouth to make sure that we are not letting it get out of control. The point of verse 3 is that the entire horse can be controlled by using something in its mouth. To control the mouth is to control the whole animal. And now I'm looking back at verse 2 and thinking, okay, he made this bold statement that if I can have self-control over my mouth, then I'm going to have self-control over the whole body. Okay, now it's making sense. I was going to go into a different image in verse 4. He says, look at ships also. Though they are so great and are driven by strong winds, they are still directed by a very small rudder, wherever the inclination of the pilot desires. Okay, so the point of the maritime illustration here in verse 4 is that a large ship can be steered by controlling one little part of it. And he's probably here, the kind of boat he's probably referring to is not talking about like a little, small boat, but probably like a passenger boat or a cargo ship or something like that. A larger ship. The words that he's using are probably referring to a larger ship here. And it's interesting because he's also using this idea of the disproportionality. If we control the little rudder, we control the entire ship. I don't know a lot about you know me. I know a lot about very little. Okay, I know a lot about some things, and I go really deep and have a long discussion. But I don't know anything about horses. I don't know anything about. We talked about birds last hour. I didn't know much about naval things. So I don't know. But I know enough to know that what he's saying here makes perfect sense. We all know that. We've all seen ships. We also the rudder is not 2/3 of the ship. I don't need that much. I don't need something that big to turn the whole ship. It's a proportionately small part of it. You might stand next to it, and it might be as tall as you or twice as tall as you, but in proportion to the whole ship, it's very small. You think, wait a minute, the whole ship is going to move based on what you do with this rudder? Yeah, that's exactly it. That's more or less what's happening here. And I think that's important. Furthermore, it's in an environment that defies control. Look what he says there in verse 4. He says, though they are great, though they are driven by strong winds. And the unspoken thing is, don't forget that they're on water, which itself, it's not like, you park your car, it's probably not going to drift down into the next neighborhood or something like that. It's probably going to stay there. You park your boat, and if you don't, it's going to drift away if you don't anchor it properly. It's on a surface that is already resistant to control, and now we have high winds coming, and it's going to resist control even more. So now we have the environment. In fact, that got me thinking. We always talk about, again, and I mentioned it earlier, 3 things about communication that I think the Bible says we got to work on: our content and our tone and our what's the other one? Timing. I was right out of there. I think James is introducing another one, and that is context. Now, we talk about that for Bible interpretation. We can't just take a verse out of context. We've got to interpret it in its context. Otherwise, we might be reading a foreign meaning into it. But I think we have to think about our situation as well. What context are we in? Is this the best time for me to have this conversation with this person? Is this maybe is this a better time? I'm at a gathering, I'm at a party. Maybe this is a better time to say, hey, I want to talk to you about this issue. Could I get together with you for lunch next week or something like that? That's where we'll have the conversation. Is the context. And again, you think, man, that's complicated. I got to think about the tone and the content and what do I say? I say too much, too harsh, not harsh enough. That's a lot to juggle. It sure is. And the failure to juggle it properly has gotten a lot of us in trouble on more than one occasion. But man, if I could grow in my ability to master the art of knowing what to say, how much to say, when not to say it, what temperature to use when I'm saying it, and to recognize, maybe this isn't, we're in kind of a wild, chaotic environment here. Maybe this is not the best time to have this conversation. Man, if I could pull all those dynamics together and grow in my wisdom and knowledge in those dynamics, then I think that's going to show a higher level of spiritual maturity on my part. And I think he's given us a great thing to shoot for here. The tie-in in verse 4 with verse 3 is that he repeats the verb to guide or to control. And James is contrasting the great and colossal size of the ship with the relatively small rudder, but he says, I could use that rudder to put some control or guidance over the ship. And the unspoken element in verse 3 is made a little more clear in verse 4, because at verse 4 he says, we are still directed by even a small rudder wherever the inclination of the pilot desires. Oh, the pilot. Okay. We don't really talk about the rider or the pilot in verse 3. It was just kind of assumed. You got the horse, you have the mechanism for control, you have someone who's using that mechanism for control. Here it's explicit. You have the boat, you have the ship, big ship, you have the mechanism for control in the rudder, and then you have the pilot who is leveraging and utilizing the rudder to be able to steer the ship where he wants it to go. There's a vehicle, a mechanism for steering, and someone doing the steering. In this case, again, the ship, the rudder, and the pilot. The pilot will either adroitly or sloppily use the rudder to steer and move the ship. Pilot's not infallible. There have been boat crashes and accidents that's happened before. We too have to control the tongue, and that will dictate the direction of our lives. And he's gonna say that in verse 5. So the tongue is a small part of the body, yet it boasts of great things. A great forest fire is set aflame by such a small fire. He's going to say, listen, this small tongue, we have to learn to control what we say, what we don't say, our speech, our content, our tone. If we don't do that, we are probably going to crash. You can't be careless steering a horse. You can't just, I guess you see those old westerns and they're just kind of going down the road. I guess, you don't have to be, too careful, but you can't be careless steering a horse. You can't be careless steering a ship. There's cargo, there's lives, there's people on the boat that could get hurt. There's people on at the port that could get hurt. There's a lot of reasons. There's a lot of damage that could be done if you are not steering this ship carefully. It takes moment by moment concentration. I don't think, maybe when you get way out to sea, but I don't think when you're trying to pilot it into port or something, you can't say, well, I'm going to go grab a sandwich or something like that, and hopefully it'll kind of float in and then we'll be fine. You can't do that. Moment by moment concentration on steering the ship. I think some Christians need to devote, okay, and I'll say me too. Let's just say Christian. Let's say all of us. It sounds like I'm saying, oh, those Christians, I've got it mastered. I do not have this mastered, as most of you know. Christians need to learn to devote that kind of attention to the things we say, that kind of concentration, that kind of steering, that kind of moment-by-moment calculation of in a chaotic situation of how is the boat doing, where are we going, are we doing this properly? You've heard the statement about someone that has no filters. Maybe you've heard someone say that, oh, they don't have any filters. Enters mind, comes out mouth. James is talking about the importance of that steering filter. If you are a Christian, you need to have a steering filter for your mouth. That's not optional. Unfiltered, thoughtless speech is incompatible with mature Christianity. It's that simple. Oh, but I'm a say what I mean and mean what I say guy. Well, maybe you were before Christ. You don't have the liberty of just claiming that about yourself. Now, I know everybody's claiming what they want to be now. You don't have the luxury and the liberty of saying, I'm just going to say whatever comes to my mind. Because now you represent Christ. You're expected to speak in a mature, godly way as someone who represents him. Unfiltered, thoughtless speech is incompatible with mature Christianity. And again, we'll just push into the next verse here and then we'll be done. James notes the idea of disproportion of the tongue in verse 5, a tremendous amount of direction and the course of our lives is determined by the tongue. Though it's small, it can achieve or boast of great things. We could do great things with our tongue. We can also create great damage with our tongue, which is his greater concern. He notes that it has the power of destruction that is disproportionate to the size, like the flames, like a small flame that sets a forest on fire. And by the way, there's another instance where the context is really important. I was just thinking, well, if you have like a fire, you get your buddies around and you have a fire on the beach, and you're roasting hot dogs and drinking beer, whatever you do, and you're on the beach. You still have to watch the fire, but you're not as concerned that it's going to set the sand on fire or something like that. If you have a fire in the woods, in a forest, see, the forest is made out of wood, and your fire needs wood, and you think, boy, I really have to contain this thing, because if I don't, it's going to go crazy and it could burn this whole place down. Amazing. You hear about these fires going on in Canada and California. These are incredibly destructive. In fact, it's a little fire, it starts, and then soon it's out of control. And that's just like our words. Can't take them back. Once they leave the mouth, it is now out of your control, and that could get very ugly soon, like a wildfire. So again, he notes the power of destruction is disproportionate to the size of the original fire. It can be a small fire, it can be a spark. You can set the whole thing on flame, because again, the woods are made with burnable material, and we've got to be mindful of that. Don't discount the power of a compliment or affirmation or gratitude. Don't discount the destructive power of a snarky comment, of a thoughtless insult, of not paying a compliment or not providing affirmation. Don't forget the power of context, not like neglecting a small fire in the forest. We'll pick it up here next week. Just want to end by reminding us the ability to tame the tongue demonstrates a high level of spiritual maturity. You can say, "Oh man, I've been going to church for 50 years." That's great. If you can't control your tongue, I don't see that. I don't see what the relevance is. How long you've been coming to church? Who cares? If you say, "Well, I'm really every day I read my Bible, I get up early, and I read that's great. So read the Bible every day for an hour and a half every morning, starting at 5:30. It's great. But if it's not transferred into the things you say, I think you're missing the point of all that wonderful, valuable Bible reading that you're doing." James notes that the taming of the tongue is the key to spiritual maturity. And I love the words of this hymn where he says, "Take my lips and let them be filled with messages for thee. Take my voice and let me sing, always, only, for my King." What a great thing to be able to control our speech and to say every word that comes out of my mouth is building up the saints around me and is glorifying the God who gave me a tongue to be able to use. Let's conclude here this morning with praise him, praise him. I would usually start with this one, but we're going to end with this one. Number 227.